All right, class, how you doing? Mr. Swenside here. Check it out. We are going to review chapter 3, which is talking about the Dakota tribe, the Dakota Nation, and there might be some different things than what we covered previously. So listen to everything, take notes, and then tomorrow when you are in class, you are going to complete a study guide to be used for a test after we've reviewed everything that we've done through the year so far. Kind of a summative exam of chapters 1 through 9. So take a listen. Your learning objectives for this chapter are: number 1, to understand that oral history or storytelling connects Dakota people to each other in the past. 2, describe the customs and values that are central to Dakota culture, including generosity, kinship, extended family, and respect. Number 3, define income and human capital. Understand how these economic concepts connect to early Dakota people. Number 4, recognize the Dakota Nation around 1700 was a large and diverse group of 7 bands that covered a wide territory. And lastly, name some states where Dakota people live today. Minnesota Makoche. This was the Dakota name for what we call Minnesota. So when the Dakota people came to what is now known as Minnesota, they called it the land where the waters are so clear that they reflect the clouds in the sky. So you think when you go up to northern Minnesota, or before the city lights were here, you've seen the stars, and you've seen how they can reflect off the waters. So that is what they said, Minnesota Makoche. Before the 1700s, when the Dakota were living mainly in wooded areas near the Mississippi River, hunting and fishing were their main methods of obtaining food. Deer were important for food and hides, and a great hunter might kill up to 60 deer in a good year. Early Dakota also hunted ducks, geese, elk, bear, muskrats, and smaller animals. They fished all year long. This lifestyle flourished on vast tracts of land, and the Dakota vigorously defended their broad territory from encroachment by others. In addition to wild rice, Dakota living near large lakes gathered many other native food plants to eat. These plants and the roots of water lilies were gathered by women standing in waist-deep water, feeling for the roots with their toes. They also gathered berries, plums, nuts, and native potatoes and wild turnips. Dakota women cultivated small fields of corn and other crops. They often found the most fertile ground near watercourses and in areas where wild artichokes grew, as this was a sign of rich soil. To shorten growing time, the women soaked corn seeds until they sprouted, then planted them in small mounds. Squash and beans were planted around the corn. The bean vines were trained up the corn stalks. As the corn grew and ripened, scaffolds were built above the crop. Women and children climbed the scaffolds to guard the crops from blackbirds, shouting to scare off the birds and to call community members for assistance. Check out this picture where it shows them doing just that. During the winter, the Dakota lived in teepees, which were portable, easy to assemble, and well designed for cold weather. The teepees, cone-shaped, helped keep the warm air lower to the ground. Teepees were made by lashing wooden poles together with leather straps to form a cone-shaped frame, then wrapping the outside of the poles with hides. The floors were often padded with grasses or skins. A large flap was used to enter and exit the teepee and could be left open to provide air circulation. Dakota women often hung a dew cloth around the inner circle of the teepee, which prevented frost from forming on the inside of the teepee. Dew cloths were often decorated with paintings of the family's history and genealogy. During the fur trade era, some Dakota began using canvas acquired in trade as coverings for their teepees. During the spring and summer, the Dakota used the same bark houses year after year. These lodges had wooded frameworks covered by bark and consisted of a single large room with entrances at each end. At the center of each village stood a council teepee or lodge where the tribal council met. Even after Dakota bands were no longer living in close proximity to one another, they continued to uphold similar values and share a common understanding of what it meant to be Dakota. In Speaking of Indians, Dakota anthropologist Ella Deloria wrote, "The ultimate aim of Dakota life, stripped of all accessories, was quite simple. One must obey kinship rules. One must be a good relative. No Dakota who has participated in that life will dispute that. Without that aim and the constant struggle to attain it, the people would no longer be Dakotas in truth. They would no longer even be human. To be a good Dakota, then, was to be humanized, civilized. And to be civilized was to keep the rules imposed by kinship for achieving civility, good manners, and a sense of responsibility toward every individual dealt with. Dakota researcher Aaron Griffin explained the connection between the kinship and another important Dakota concept, extended family, in the book Minnesota Makoche. A person's relatives were not limited to the nuclear family. Instead, Dakota kinship allowed for something much larger. A father's brothers were counted as one's fathers, a father's sisters were aunts, a mother's sisters were counted as one's mothers, and her brothers would be uncles. Correspondingly, their children would be considered one's brothers and sisters. According to this practice, no matter how distant, a relative would be claimed. This inclusiveness was the extended family. Following kinship rules was a way of life, far more complex than just knowing one's relations. In this way, a Dakota person could undoubtedly find a relative almost anywhere when traveling within the Dakota Nation. Kinship rules also provided a sense of security and acknowledgement of the laws by which people were governed.
The Badger and the Bear. A family of badgers lived in a comfortable little house under a hill. One day, a visitor appeared at the badger family's door. It was a large black bear. He looked very hungry. The badger children were afraid, but the parents were not. They welcomed the stranger inside and invited him to take a seat. The mother cooked a thick slice of deer meat called venison and offered it to the guest. The bear devoured the meat. When he was done, he ambled away without a word. The next day, the bear returned. Again, the badgers invited him in and fed him. The bear came back every day for many weeks. Each time, the badgers welcomed him with smiles and open arms. Then one day, the bear showed up at the badger's door with his family. In a gruff voice, he ordered the badgers to leave the house so that his family could move in. The badgers knew they could not argue with the bear. They cried as they left their cozy home. That night they slept cold and hungry under a great rock. After several nights with no food, the father badger returned to the den to beg the bear for a few pieces of meat. "I would not trouble you," he said, "but my little folks are starving." The bear just laughed at the badger and told him to go away. Finally, a powerful being known as the Avenger learned of the badger's troubles. He headed for the den to teach the bear a lesson. When the bear saw the Avenger approaching, he shook with fear. He fled the house with his family, never to return. When the bear family was gone, the badgers moved back into their little home. Their troubles were over. The Ghost Wife. There once was a young man who preferred to live away from his people. He spent most of his days among the animals, learning their ways and their language. Most of the people of his village thought he was strange. One day, while he was lying in a meadow, a beautiful young woman appeared before him. He recognized her. She was the daughter of one of his village's most respected elders. The young man had never paid much attention to her. He was always too busy with his animal friends. But now, as she stood before him, he fell in love with her. And then he remembered she had died 10 days before. She was a ghost. The young man pushed away his fear and determined to make the young woman his wife. Every day he left his village to meet secretly with his new love. He built her a lodge made of pine boughs. She cooked him meals of venison and mended his moccasins. They lived happily together as husband and wife. Soon, though, the young man grew tired of secrecy. He wanted his family to meet his new wife. He asked her to move to the village with him. "I will," she replied, "but only if you agree to live by my rules." The most important rule was that the young man should never raise his voice in the teepee. "I agree," he said. The young couple moved to the village. They lived apart from the rest of the people in a small white teepee. With time, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. They were very happy. Then one night, the young man came home tired and hungry after a long hunt. The children began to cry and would not be quieted. Their father, forgetting his promise, yelled at them. Instantly, the fire went out and the teepee went dark. The children and their mother vanished, and to the young man's eternal regret, they never returned.
The Dakota concept of education was different from the European model. The Dakota, who practiced careful observation and adaptation to the world around them, taught their children through example. Children learned the skills they would need by copying adults and through constant practice. Children were told to carefully observe the world around them, and later were asked what they had seen. Children were trained to be future naturalists, gatherers, and hunters through the asking of questions such as, on which side of the trees is the lighter colored bark? Or how do you know that there are fish in the lake? Young children were taught first to be good listeners. Children not only listened to stories, but also were expected to recall them on subsequent evenings. One-on-one mentorship and discussion was an important part of the education of any young boy or girl, and children were spoken to kindly. In the education of their children, Dakota parents did not approve of subduing the spirit of the child by force, so corporal punishment was rarely used. While the content of education varied between the genders, both boys and girls were taught to be independent and self-reliant. Patience and self-sacrifice were practiced. Young children were expected to learn to fast without complaining. Children learned to survive and thrive in nature. Taught to regard winter conditions, Dakota children were rarely injured by the frost. Children were often named after a great ancestor or respected tribal member. The noble deeds of the person were often repeated to the namesake in order to inspire honorable behavior in the child. Children were spoken of as the future mothers or defenders of their people. From an early age, they were encouraged to learn and act with these serious responsibilities in mind. Here we're going to read about human capital in the early Dakota culture, different from income as we know it today. Press pause here and read about human capital. When finished, move on to the next slide. As you recall, in the Dakota Nation, history does not move in a straight line or a linear fashion. It moves in a circle. Read about this, press pause, and when you're done, move on to the next slide. For your reflection, I want you to think about this question. How is the Dakota society different from our society today? I want you to write 2 to 3 sentences and use at least 3 of the vocabulary words listed below.